everyone. I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. Excited to bring you another in our series of health IT interviews. And today's guest is Daniel Cidon. He's CTO at NextGate. Welcome, Danny.
Oh, thank you, John. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, well, we've talked a lot, so this is kind of I love having people back because then you get like a nice series of things, and you've done a lot of articles on Healthcare IT Today, guest articles. So I feel like I know a lot about you, but
we've known each other for quite a while. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it's good, cool. But today's topic of digital identity is something we haven't talked about too much. But before we dive into that, tell us a little bit about yourself and NextGate.
Sure. My role at NextGate is the Chief Technology Officer, and NextGate was a company that was formed, we got 16 years, I think, at this point. Wow. And our focus has been on trying to help organizations to identify patients and providers of care accurately across disparate systems. So it's something that recently, as you say, with digital identity, there's some new avenues available to us, and it's kind of an interesting area.
Yeah, so let's talk about it. Like, what is digital identity? I'm seeing it being used by a lot of the health IT industry now, but what do you see?
It is an ambiguous term, and it can mean a number of different things. I mean, at the end of the day, it's allowing a software system to be able to communicate with some actor within that application. So if you're a user, if you're a patient, or if you're a doctor, these are different. There is a need to be able to say, hey, this is who I am, so that you can conduct, some business, whatever that may be. And so, digital identity encompasses that kind of authentication of, this is who I am, and you can reliably communicate with the same person over and over again with the same digital identity, and being able to prove that that person really owns that identity. But then there's a whole kind of other piece of it, which is really more around levels of assurance that attributes that are associated to that digital ID really belong to you. So is my name really Daniel Cidon, or am I really just somebody else? And I'm just going with saying that that's my name, and so that's a different thing. I mean, it's part of digital identity, but to the extent that organizations need that level of assurance for different attributes, that's a decision based on whatever particular use case there is. So digital identity goes all the way from really not much more than just a username with very little verification to something as sophisticated as like a biometric passport, where there's a very high level of assurance that the attributes associated are accurate representation of that individual. I don't know if that helped. It's a very kind of hard to say, like, in a nutshell, I guess.
I think one of the challenges is that, like, even your simple example gets confused really quickly. I don't think people understand how hard digital identity really is, because you said my name is Daniel Cidon, but sometimes you're called Danny, right? So you just ruined your digital identity already. It feels like, right? I mean, it's complex.
Well, I mean, it's part of the reason, like what you're describing is part of the reason why using identifying attributes like names and addresses and phone numbers and all that is kind of like a poor way of uniquely identifying an individual. And that's been the way that healthcare and many organizations have, or many verticals have operated, and just kind of taking a best guess. Like if I want to get a big picture of somebody and I don't really have some sort of portable, unique ID that can kind of thread all that data, then we do the whole Daniel, Danny. I mean, that's what our software has been doing. We're going on 16 years. It's a complicated business, but it unfortunately never gets us to the 100%. And that's why, we feel pretty strongly that the only way to get there is to start down this path of really giving people credentials that they can carry with them and present to say, this is who I am. I'm not Dan or Danny or whatever. I am this ID. And that's how, I should be known.
Interesting. Well, and we won't go down the path of National Patient Identifier. There's a great video you can check out that we already did on that. But, what really does constitute like an individual's identity in healthcare, and how is it being used? Is it, and I guess part of it for me is also the governance, like who should manage the person's identity and verify it.
Those are really,
that's part of the problem too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the digital identity in healthcare, basically that's the root of, all of the clinical information that organizations, gather over the years as you're treated at multiple facilities. And typically, most healthcare organizations do want to tie that to a set of identifying attributes, such as your name, contact information like your address, phone number, email, and things like that, so they can reach out to you, so that they can send you a bill. There are cases where the identity is can remain anonymous. There's certain services where that's desirable, but by and large, most healthcare organizations want to have a fairly good understanding of who you are. And so, but the way that we're trying to construct identity for our customers in healthcare, digital identity, is that we're assuming that most of the organizations that are going to be using it want to have some level of assurance on basic attributes about you. And it is a tough question, in terms of like who really is in control of that, like who can really say and dictate, hey, I just moved to a new address, or this is my new phone number. And the way that we're constructing this in our solution is we are going to let that fight kind of play out in the real world, in the sense that the patient will be able to give their view of the world in terms of, this is who I claim that I am. But then the organization can also produce their own credentials and decide what elements of the patient contributed data they wish to include in their records. Because at this stage of the game, we're going basically from a setup where patients have very little visibility and very little control over their identity, to one where we're trying to put the patient more in the driver's seat, but we can't just put them there immediately. And there are definitely certain safeguards that it's totally understandable that organizations would want to put up before allowing people to just run rampant and basically define their identity on their own.
Yeah. Well, I imagine you've had a lot of experience with a lot of different organizations, some that do digital ID the right way, and some that probably weren't doing it the right way when you met them. What are some of the consequences to that? And it seems it seems scary, right?
Yeah, well, I don't think anybody does it the right way at this point.
Okay.
And there are ways that have worked better, but even there, I would say that it's not really the right way. So we've always felt, with NextGate, and maybe we're biased because we're a vendor for master patient index and provider registries, but from our point of view, the identity never should belong to any one particular system, any one EHR, for example, any dominant player within a IDN, or it's something where the people, the actors that participate in healthcare, exist outside of that particular healthcare enterprise. So to define them and say, well, you only exist because you're a record in this EHR, really, doesn't make sense. So the EMPI, the way that we approached it 15 years back was always to tell people, let us be the central repository of all the patients that you treat, no matter what system is touching them. At least get to that point where you're not locking their existence to one particular system. And I think that's certainly better than taking a strategy that says, I'm going to just let one clinical application represent all of my patients, because that really has led to all sorts of problems. And the issue is if you manage patient identity badly in healthcare, it usually has a rather nasty outcome, right? I mean, it's either reduced patient satisfaction because now a patient is calling in and the doctor has like no idea about some procedure or some test result or whatever that came in. Things like get lost in the process, billing problems occur. And the worst case, if you've mistakenly identified somebody, you can end up killing them, right? Because you end up not having the correct picture on things like what medications they're on, what allergies they have. Some of these things have very serious, repercussions. So it's it's important in any industry, but like if you make an order or something for something on Amazon or whatever, and they screw up your address and they send it to somebody else, or whatever, it's not. Yeah, like I had actually during this pandemic, a lot of us have done this, right? Like where we try to find as many things as we can do, online, and avoid, going, to the grocery store or whatever. So I signed up for some service. I can't remember which it was, Instacart or one of these things. And one day, I opened up my door, and just outside there was like these 3 or 4 bags of like stuff that I never ordered. Like, I'm pretty sure I didn't ask for lipstick, you know what I mean? And it shows up at my door.
Sure?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, John. Yeah. I did ask my daughter, like, are you, 13
are you
or whatever.
ordering on my account?
Yeah, did you order on my account?
Security issue.
But no, they just screwed up. So like, I got somebody's stuff and somebody didn't get their stuff. Okay, that's not super tragic. As compared to something, where my sister, for example, has a very strong reaction to certain types of anesthesia. It's a kind of a cardiac arrhythmia that forms. And she was explaining to me once, how she had some sort of emergency happen, and she was trying to communicate to the doctors, like in this kind of half-conscious state, don't give me this med, because if you give me this one, you're going to be in for a lot of trouble. You know what I mean? So having a view of that, really is centered around knowing, well, okay, when my sister shows up, well, who is this person? And having a means of communicating that, and then having access to the records as a result, is really, really very important.
Yeah. And with the push to access those records, I think the digital identity
Yes.
is becoming more and more important.
Absolutely.
As we exchange the data, as we enable new APIs, et cetera, right? You don't want to transfer the data to these third-party apps and with the wrong ID.
Correct. And that's another avenue that we're trying to kind of educate our customers, that when we talk about communicating digital identity, it's both at the point of registration or the point of service, like when you physically go in for something, to be able to communicate your identity, but also increasingly important are these kind of virtual visits, and portals and other kinds of things that patients are being given access to, and unifying those two things so that one identity kind of acts as the key, to identifying yourself at a point of care, as well as if you're, on your browser or on your app and you're trying to say, well, who am I? Those are two things that have kind of lived in separate worlds for a really long time. Digital access to something and then physical access to a facility, have been kind of almost like two separate worlds, I would say.
Yeah. So you've shared a little bit about how NextGate approaches this, but how are you approaching digital identity? And tell us a little bit about your OneDid product, and how does that play in with your EMPI product as well?
Yeah, well, for years, we've been trying to find a way to leverage the power of things like, smartphones in identifying an individual. And over the last few years, there's been increasing momentum in the establishment of standards to create a portable identifier, one that's globally unique and portable, and that can live in a kind of digital wallet. The last thing, we didn't want to invent yet another identifier. You know what I mean? And I think that was part of the problem in the whole concept of a national patient identifier. Is like, is this just going to be yet another number?
Yeah.
Like a Medicare number or the Social Security number or whatever. And the answer is likely, if it was literally just going to be a number, then yeah, probably, because it would be inherently flawed in that there would be duplications, and then you'd have to wonder, is this the correct one or not? But so we were playing a bit of a wait and see, just to see where the industry would start to gather its momentum, and really around this specification known as decentralized identity. That's where we've seen a lot of traction across a lot of different industries, starting really with finance, where they have more kind of stringent need to identify an individual, for like banking applications and such, where you really need to have a strong attestation to, things like a person's name and address and other attributes that identify them. So once we saw that starting to move forward, then we decided that we were going to really base our strategy on something that is portable, because that way we can go to our customers and say, look, this is eventually going to be where the future lies. It's going to be something that's as common as, oh, I'm going to go to a website and I want to do a secure banking transaction, or I want to shop for something, and you see the little SSL kind of padlock and whatever.
Yeah.
And everyone, that's just kind of like this ubiquitous standard around public-private key infrastructure that allows people to feel a level of trust, that when they interact with that Amazon or whatever it is, that really is Amazon. It's not somebody else, and we really feel strongly that that's the way identity is going to be slowly moving worldwide, and not just in healthcare, and not just in the United States, but it's a slow progression. In any case, the approach that we've taken is we want to be the first, starting on the patient side, the first EMPI to support producing and accepting, digital credentials, because some of our customers, we've had them since the very start, 15 years.
Yeah.
They've been managing and curating their data set for all that time. It's a tremendous amount of effort that they put in, and so they have some reasonable notion of the patients that they're taking care of.
Yeah.
Why not then leverage all of that and say, okay, now from there we can use that as our starting point for creating digital credentials, and then we can slowly involve the patient in improving the quality of the data. If you see something that's not quite right in your record, well, then let us know, and we'll issue you a new credential with an updated address, So that's our approach. It's a little bit, essentially what it looks like, John, is that there's an app that runs on your mobile phone.
Uh-huh.
And at every kind of point of service, whether it's physical or virtual, you scan a QR code that says, I am at this facility, or I'm on my browser and I'm trying to log into this, portal or whatever it is.
Uh-huh.
And at that point, what happens is you're transmitting your credential. So it's under your control as a patient. You're transmitting your credential to that organization. And generally speaking, at the start, that organization was the issuer of that credential to you. And so they'll look at that. They'll see that it hasn't been tampered with in any way through some of this kind of cryptographic, magic.
Yep.
And at that point, you're in the sense that you've been either registered at a point of care, or you've logged into, that particular digital service. It's at a high level, at least. Yeah.
Well, and it's nice because then the patient knows that they're being identified correctly, but also the organization knows that that patient is indeed the one that they thought.
Yes. It's critically important.
Like a valuable thing.
You would think, right? Like that they would know who you are, and that you would be able to have some visibility into who they think you are in terms of what attributes they have, on you. Because I think organizations do want. We see this, for example, when it comes to the topic of reference data, that organizations are saying, well, can we enrich, the view that we have about this patient by going to some third-party reference data provider? And we do have that in our product set as well.
Uh-huh.
But in some ways, it's a little bit of a kind of a flawed concept, right? In that, you're asking yet another party with its own kind of set of data governance to say, well, I think that this, John's address is that, well, maybe John didn't want to contribute that address for a reason,
Yeah.
So there's no question in my mind that organizations want to have a better picture of you, and certain elements are super critical that they get right. So we think that this is something that is going to be accepted, in that they see the benefit, and they also see that they still have the same amount of control at the end of the day. They're still the issuers of the credential. You have your own credential, which we call the one-did credential, which is more in the patient's control. But each provider is allowed to produce their own credential as well. So, we can try to strike that balance and see where people land with it.
Gotcha. And I can see how a patient would like it because, I just think of my friend Erin Gilmer, who actually just passed away, and she would often talk about exactly the situation that you're talking about. Why am I not in more control over what information they have? Which, I think is an interesting discussion. But I think on the other side of things, there is the fear about this as well. And so maybe you could talk to this is, does this one-did credential help or hurt when it comes to data security and protection?
Oh,
because if one place, one identity, that scares a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, and actually that's why we're not looking to produce it. You know, so the way the one did works is you can create any number of credentials, you know. So if you get treated by 10 different organizations and each one of them wants to kind of manage their own credential, that's absolutely possible to do. And it's not the case where we're centralizing all the information about you anywhere, really. There is really no central kind of component to this except this part that's related to where people can essentially find your public key, you know. So the public key is something that is exposed in the way that by its nature people should be able to look at it. So if you sign something with your private key, then you know, people can decrypt it or ensure that it hasn't been tampered with by using your public key, but no information about you is ever exposed. You know, so the actual credential with your name, with, you know, your birth date, your address, your phone number, none of that stuff exists anywhere centrally. So that's another kind of super important component of this that we felt. You know, we never took at NextGate the approach, even though we have, you know, over 100 plus installations of our EMPI all over the country, and some, I don't even know what we're up to, 280 million, you know, patients or whatever. I always think of it like hamburgers sold, you know, on the McDonald's sign. Like at some point,
Yeah.
it's the billions and billions. But
at some point, there's too many.
Yeah, it's just like lots of hamburgers sold, you know. But we have them as kind of independent, you know, silos in a way. You know, and we never tried to. We never felt that we owned that data, you know, certainly. And you know, that's the whole issue of trying to centralize things into one place, because then, you know, there's been some very high profile kind of breaches that have happened, you know, with some of the credit bureaus in particular that do have this kind of, like, you know, databases of close to 300 million people. That's very dangerous. And I think that if we try to move in that direction, then I would agree we could certainly do more harm than good. But essentially, you know, it would get to a point where if you wanted to get information about 300 million people, you would have to hack into 300 million phones. Like it is coming back to kind of the end device. And then you're transmitting the credential from your end device, but your credential is not sitting somewhere, you know, locally where it can get hacked and you know, people can get all sorts of identifying information.
Yeah. So talk about what is the role of this digital identity that, you know, it's nice. We'll have it on the phone. We go in, you know, I got the, you know, scan the QR code, but,
right.
you know, how does that help when it comes to patient matching, identification? What if I go to a system who doesn't have it? I mean, or you know, how is this going to flow where it's really going to help solve some of those problems?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, you know, we are looking to leverage our existing EMPI to help with this, because you're absolutely right. Just because I have a credential and I wave it around or I scan it, you know, on a QR code and it gets transmitted, it doesn't relate to anything, you know, that an organization may already have over the last 20 years, you know. And I can't think of any clinical system that is, you know, on board with this whole decentralized ID and verifiable credential standards. I mean, these are all kind of like bleeding edge things, you know, and healthcare generally, you know, takes forever to kind of catch up with things. So we are creating certain, I would say almost like bridge capabilities within the product, you know. So the first bridge is the EMPI itself, in the sense that when you issue your credential already will include all of your legacy identifiers, you know. And for some of our customers, they have like, you know, 20, 30 different identifiers, all these different systems that they've spent so much time integrating together, you know, with the EMPI as a crosswalk. Well, basically the crosswalk comes with the credential, which is huge, because, you know, it basically says now, if you transmit your credential and you say, hey, I'm John, well, not just that, but now I know all the pointers to, you know, John's record at the local facility. So that's kind of one important piece of trying to make this a reality. You know, the other one is that we intend to also do some automation, you know. So when you scan the QR code, it presents the credential to the registrar, shows your picture that you've taken as a selfie that's part of your credential, maybe the driver's license if you've scanned it. But then it'll also send outbound HL7 messages to say, hey, you know what, here he is, start the admission sequence, whatever it may be. because many organizations already have like a very elaborate process for inpatients, certainly.
Yeah.
And so, for example, like, the wristband, with the QR code printed and all that, all those capabilities, our view on it is basically we just have to kick off the process, and so we are adding some integration capabilities as well, because that's just something we're very familiar with as an EMPI vendor, just having to deal with the plumbing. There's a lot of plumbing that organizations have internally.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's such a big problem, patient matching, identity. My favorite is John Doe showing up to the ED, right?
Oh gosh, yeah.
It's challenging, but there's thousands of situations that are similar where something gets crossed. So anything we can do to improve that is just a big step forward.
It is, and you bring up a lot of interesting points. So right now, our approach has been assuming that a person has a mobile phone and is in a state where they can unlock their mobile phone and scan a QR code and have the credential transmitted. There are examples, as you said, where that's not true. Yep. You're on the street bleeding, or you're just not mentally capable of it. So we will eventually start to introduce also the capability that a person can have a printed QR code, like on a bracelet or something of that sort, or a sticker that's on an insurance card, so that if an organization were to scan that, it would point to a person's credentials, not on their phone, but rather on an agent, and then it's a question of whether that agent should consent to that treating organization, to see any information. It's a very tricky business, because there's lots of, the reason we haven't jumped into that right off the get-go is that it introduces all sorts of security vulnerabilities that have to be very carefully thought through. But you make an excellent point. The other really important point is around the notion of guarantors. Like I would like to be able to, on behalf of my daughter, communicate her identity, and my son, so being able to deal with multiple family members for which you have you are responsible for their care is also kind of an important area, and something that we're working on as well.
Yeah. Well, I think hackers have proved one thing, and that is the way we've done it forever is not very secure. I walk in and I just give them the info and they trust that I'm giving them the right info. That's not very secure. So I think this is a huge step forward from a security and identity standpoint. It will be fun to see how it evolves. Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
No, I always get excited when you're talking about this topic. I think that the final thought is, if you're not paying attention to this space, and if you think that this industry is going to continue muddling along the way it has for the last 10 or 20 years, I would say think again, because there's been tremendous progress. I think that at some point, it may not be driven first through healthcare, it may be through other industries, but at some point, it's just going to come out of nowhere. And if people haven't been kind of paying attention to it, and it's going to really revolutionize a lot of interactions, in terms of how people are doing things today. So keep an eye on the space, I guess, would be my advice.
Yeah, and that's great advice. It may come from other industries and hit us in the face.
Yes,
so
it likely will, based on how slow healthcare is generally.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for sharing your insights and perspectives, Danny. And we'll watch as it all progresses, and definitely cover it on Healthcare IT Today. Thanks everyone for watching. If you want to find more great health IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.